a school hallway filled with students, laughter, and the usual rush of the day. But in the middle of it all, a young girl stands frozen, eyes filled with fear, hands clutching her chest. No one notices, no one stops, except one man. And what he hears next will change everything. The school hallway was filled with the usual hustle and bustle. Students rushed between classrooms, some laughing with friends, others glued to their phones. The sound of lockers slamming and shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor echoed through the hall. It was the typical chaotic energy of a school day, a sea of youthful noise and movement. Yet, amid the constant motion, one small figure stood perfectly still. Emma, a 7-year-old girl, stood motionless near her locker, her back pressed against the cool metal. Her small frame was swallowed by the noise around her, yet she seemed completely isolated. Her eyes were wide with fear, filled with tears that glistened as they welled up. But she didn't move. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps, and her hands trembled as she clutched her chest, as if trying to hold something inside. Something was terribly wrong. The other students flowed around her, oblivious to the girl standing frozen in the middle of the hall. Laughter rang out nearby, a group of friends passing by chatting animatedly, completely unaware of the silent terror that held Emma captive. Not a single person stopped to notice her. Not a single person seemed to care. The noise of the hallway continued, and the world moved on. But then one man noticed. Mr. Dawson, the janitor, was pushing his cleaning cart down the hall. His green uniform blended in with the rest of the background, a familiar sight to anyone who attended the school. He was used to seeing all sorts of things in the hallways, spilled juice, stray papers, and the occasional prank. But today, something caught his attention. He saw Emma standing near the lockers, her face pale and her body trembling, seemingly lost in her own world. The sight stopped Mr. Dawson in his tracks. He had worked at the school long enough to know when something wasn't right, when a child needed help. He wasn't the kind of man to ignore the small things, the subtle signs that others missed. Something in the way Emma was standing, her rigid posture, her unblinking stare, the way her hands trembled, told him that this wasn't just another kid being shy or nervous. This was different. This was fear. He set his cleaning supplies down on the floor and moved toward her. His steps were calm, deliberate, as he approached the girl who seemed so out of place amidst the noise. When he got close enough, he knelt down in front of her, his eyes softening as he spoke gently. "Hey, sweetheart, are you okay?" Mr. Dawson's voice was low, filled with a warmth that only someone who truly cared could express. He had seen kids scared or upset before, but Emma's terror was different. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously around the hallway as though she feared something, someone was watching her. Emma flinched slightly when he spoke, as if startled by the sudden attention. She looked around again, her eyes scanning the crowd of students that continued to rush past, completely unaware of her. It was as if she was looking for something or someone, before her eyes fell back to Mr. Dawson. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, quivering with fear. I can't escape him." Mr. Dawson's heart sank. The words hit him like a cold wave. The desperation in her voice, the way she clutched her chest, it was clear this wasn't just a typical school day meltdown. Emma was terrified, genuinely terrified, and her words made it all too clear that she was not safe. "I can't escape him," she repeated, her eyes wide with panic, her breath shallow. Mr. Dawson's face darkened, the playful warmth that usually accompanied his demeanor fading. He had heard enough over the years to understand the weight of her words. This wasn't a simple childhood fear or a bad day. This was something darker, something deeper. Emma was in danger, and from the look in her eyes it was clear she felt completely trapped. He didn't need to ask more questions. Her words told him everything he needed to know. He knew that something far more sinister was happening. Emma wasn't just standing in the hallway, frozen in fear for no reason. She was terrified of someone who made her feel as if she couldn't escape. Someone who had likely made her feel small, powerless, and afraid for far too long. Mr. Dawson felt a surge of protective instinct. He knew he couldn't let this go unnoticed, not when a child was involved. He had to act, to do whatever it took to make sure Emma wasn't facing whatever it was she was so scared of alone. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, trying to calm her, trying to ground her in the midst of the chaos. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly, looking into her eyes. "You're safe now. I'm here, all right? Let's get you somewhere safe. You're not alone." Emma, still trembling, finally allowed herself to meet his gaze, the tiniest glimmer of trust flickering in her eyes. For the first time since he had approached her, her breathing steadied. She hadn't escaped the fear yet, but maybe, just maybe, she had found a way out of the isolation and terror that had held her captive. And with that, Mr. Dawson knew that everything was about to change. What had started as a routine school day would soon become something much bigger, something that no one in the school, not even Emma, had expected. Emma had always been a bright, happy child, full of energy, eager to learn, and constantly asking questions. Her teachers knew her as the kind of student who raised her hand to answer, always sitting at the front of the class, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. Her smile was infectious, and her enthusiasm for school was evident in the way she walked into the classroom each day. She had a natural curiosity about the world, and nothing seemed able to dim her spirit. But then something began to change. Slowly, so subtly at first that no one noticed, Emma's spark started to fade. Her usual chatter during recess grew quieter, replaced by long silences. The once energetic child now seemed distant, as though her thoughts were elsewhere, far from the world of math, problems, and spelling tests. She no longer eagerly raised her hand in class, and her attention drifted in ways that her teachers had never seen before. At first, her teachers assumed it was just a phase, a temporary drop in enthusiasm, a shift that sometimes happens when children face new challenges or growing pains. They attributed her quiet behavior to the normal fluctuations of childhood. It wasn't until the change persisted that they began to take note, but by then it was too late. Emma wasn't just going through a phase. She was fighting something much darker. What no one knew, what no one could possibly have understood, was that Emma had a secret so terrifying that she could barely speak of it herself. There was a man who had been watching her, following her wherever she went. Every corner she turned, every time she glanced over her shoulder, he was there. He lurked in the background of her life, like a shadow that refused to disappear, always present, always waiting. Whether it was after school when she walked home, or during recess when she played with friends, he was never far. She'd feel his eyes on her, a constant pressure, as if he was always one step behind her. She knew he was there even when she couldn't see him, and the feeling of his gaze made her skin crawl. It started small, just fleeting moments when she would catch a glimpse of him standing far off in the distance, his eyes fixed on her, but it quickly escalated. Emma's mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Why me? What does he want? Why is he always watching? Every time she stepped outside, every time she walked to school, it felt like he was waiting, like he knew her every move before she even made it. It was no longer just an occasional feeling. Emma began to live in fear, wondering when he would appear next, what he would do next. She tried to tell someone. Once, when she felt her heart pounding in her chest, desperate to be heard, Emma found herself alone with a teacher. She spoke up, her voice trembling, telling them about the man who had been following her. But instead of the comfort and understanding she so desperately needed, the teacher only offered a dismissive smile and a wave of the hand. "Just stay with your friends, okay?" she said. "Everything's fine, sweetie." That was it. No one listened. No one took her seriously. Emma's heart sank, and in that moment, she learned a painful lesson. The world around her wasn't as safe as she had once thought. The very people she trusted to protect her had dismissed her fear without a second thought. She had tried to speak out, but her words had been swallowed by apathy. And so, Emma stopped talking about it. She stopped telling anyone what was happening, stopped sharing her fear. It seemed as if no one cared, and the silence became her only refuge. For weeks, she carried the burden of her fear alone. The man's presence seemed to grow with each passing day, like a shadow growing longer as the sun set. The fear tightened around her chest, suffocating her every time she stepped out of the house, every time she walked down the hall at school. She couldn't escape it. There was no way out. She had tried to talk, and no one listened. So Emma resigned herself to a life of quiet terror, her fear festering in the corners of her mind, hidden behind the mask of a shy, withdrawn child. Until today. Today, when Mr. Dawson, the janitor, noticed her standing there, frozen in the hallway, her eyes filled with terror and her hands clutching her chest. Today, when he was the first to see that something was terribly wrong. Emma had stopped being silent, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't have to face her fear alone. There was someone who cared enough to notice, someone who was willing to listen, someone who would believe her. And in that moment, as she whispered those words, "I can't escape him," Emma knew for the first time that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to be afraid anymore. The moment Emma whispered, "I can't escape him," something inside Mr. Dawson clicked. It wasn't just a child having a rough day or a panic attack. No, this was fear, a deep, real, bone-chilling fear. The kind of fear that ran so deep it couldn't be hidden. It was clear to him now that Emma wasn't just having a bad day. She wasn't just a little nervous. Something far worse was happening. His heart dropped into his stomach as the weight of her words settled over him. His hand instinctively reached out, placing itself gently on her trembling shoulder, trying to offer some comfort, some reassurance in the midst of her distress. "Who can't you escape, Emma?" Mr. Dawson asked, his voice quiet but urgent. He needed to understand. He needed to know who had put this kind of terror in a young girl. Emma's eyes darted around the hallway, her small frame shaking as if she were caught in a storm. She glanced over her shoulder as though searching for something, someone. And then, with a trembling sigh, she leaned in closer to him. The quiet words she spoke next sent an ice-cold chill down Mr. Dawson's spine. "He's here. He's in the school." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything Mr. Dawson had ever heard before. The weight of the statement settled on his shoulders, and for a brief moment he was frozen, just like Emma had been moments earlier. The fear in her voice was unmistakable. She wasn't just afraid. She was terrified. Mr. Dawson's instincts kicked in. He straightened his back, trying to keep his composure. Though his mind was racing, he had to protect her. He had to keep her safe. His job had always been to clean the school and keep it running smoothly. But this was something entirely different. This was about protecting a child, his child, in a place that was supposed to be safe. "Emma," he said softly but firmly, his eyes locking with hers. "You're safe with me. I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." He had no idea who she was talking about, but one thing was clear. Whoever this person was, they had terrified Emma to her core. Mr. Dawson's gaze swept over the hallway, instinctively scanning the area, looking for anything that might explain Emma's panic. He had to be on alert. He had to be prepared for anything. As his eyes scanned the hall, something caught his attention. In the distance, down near the end of the corridor, a figure was standing perfectly still. A man, dressed in dark clothing, blending in with the shadows. He was just standing there, watching. Mr. Dawson's stomach dropped. There was no doubt in his mind. This was the person Emma was so terrified of. The figure in the distance didn't belong here. He wasn't a student. He wasn't a teacher. He was someone who didn't belong in this school at all. Without missing a beat, Mr. Dawson stood up, slowly guiding Emma behind him. He kept his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "Emma, I need you to stay close to me, all right? Just stay behind me, and we'll get you out of here." His eyes never left the figure at the end of the hallway. He could feel his pulse quickening, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He didn't know who this person was or what their intentions were. But he knew one thing. Emma's safety was his responsibility now. As he slowly began to move toward the door, the figure at the end of the hall seemed to shift. For a moment, it looked as if the stranger was moving toward them. Mr. Dawson's heart skipped a beat, but then, just as quickly as I had appeared, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows. He was gone. For a split second, Mr. Dawson stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the man had stood. His mind raced. Had he imagined it? Was Emma mistaken? But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't over. The figure had vanished, but that didn't mean the threat was gone. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, and Emma wasn't safe until it was dealt with. Mr. Dawson didn't waste another second. He ushered Emma toward the nearest classroom, his voice calm but urgent as he said, "Let's get inside, Emma. We'll be safe in there." He knew he had to act quickly. The danger was real, and this wasn't something that could wait. As he glanced back down the hallway, the camera slowly panning to where the figure had disappeared, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. The hall was empty now, but the fear that had taken root in Emma's eyes remained fresh in his mind. Who was that man? Why was he here? What did he want? Where are you watching from? The question was simple, but it lingered in Mr. Dawson's mind. And if you were in my shoes right now, what would you do next? The hallway was empty. The silence was deafening. But deep inside, Mr. Dawson knew one thing with certainty. This was just the beginning. The janitor's storage room was small, tucked away at the far end of the hallway, a quiet refuge from the chaos of the school. It was dimly lit, with only a few shelves stacked high with cleaning supplies and spare equipment. Mr. Dawson ushered Emma inside, gently closing the door behind them. The moment it clicked shut, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. Emma's small body trembled as she sat on a crate, her hands still clutching her chest, her breath shaky. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the hallway was starting to wear off, leaving her exhausted, her fear still visible in her eyes. Mr. Dawson could see that she needed comfort, But more than that, she needed to be heard. He knelt down in front of her, his voice steady, but filled with concern. "You're safe here," he said softly, his eyes scanning her face. "You're safe with me. But I need you to tell me everything, Emma. Whatever's been happening, you're not alone now." For a long moment, Emma remained silent. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to Mr. Dawson. She hesitated, unsure whether she should speak, but something in the warmth of his voice seemed to coax the words out of her. She let out a shaky breath and finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "He follows me home," she began, her voice trembling as she looked down at her hands. "He stands outside our house at night, just watching. I told my mom about it, but she said I was imagining it. She said I was just scared of the dark, that it was nothing." Mr. Dawson's heart tightened. It was worse than he thought. This wasn't just a case of some random stranger wandering around the school. This man had been stalking Emma, following her even when she was at home, invading the one place where she should feel safe. The thought of this man lingering outside her house, watching her through the dark windows, made Mr. Dawson's blood run cold. "Did anyone else see him, Emma?" Mr. Dawson asked, his voice barely above a murmur. "Did your mom or anyone else notice him?" Emma shook her head slowly. "No, just me. But I know what I saw. He was always there. He never speaks. He never comes close. But he watches. I can feel him." Mr. Dawson's jaw clenched as he processed what Emma had said. It was clear now. This man wasn't just some random figure. He was calculating, deliberate. And now he had made his way inside the school. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was here. "Can you tell me what he looks like?" Mr. Dawson asked gently, though he already feared the answer. Emma nodded, her eyes still wide with fear. "He's tall. He always wears dark clothes and a cap. I don't know what kind of cap, but it covers his face. I don't know why, but I can always tell when he's close. It's like he's always just watching me. And today I saw him inside." Her words hit Mr. Dawson like a punch to the gut. Inside. This wasn't just a random appearance in the school parking lot. This man had been here, lurking within the walls, where children were supposed to feel safe. And now Emma had seen him. He wasn't just some shadow in the distance. He was here, right inside their school, and that made everything more terrifying. The hairs on the back of Mr. Dawson's neck stood up as the full gravity of the situation settled in. He knew what had to be done. This was not something that could be handled alone. He couldn't wait for anyone else to notice. He had to act now. Without a second thought, Mr. Dawson reached for his phone in his pocket. His fingers moved quickly, almost instinctively. He unlocked the screen and dialed 911. His heart was pounding, his mind racing as he prepared to speak, but he needed to remain calm. For Emma, for everyone. The phone rang, each second feeling like an eternity. When the operator answered, he took a deep breath. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. Mr. Dawson's voice was steady, but there was an urgency in his tone. I'm at a school. There's a man who's been stalking one of the students here. He's been following her for weeks, and today we believe he's inside the building. I need immediate assistance. The operator's voice shifted quickly, recognizing the seriousness of the situation. Okay, sir. Stay on the line. We're sending officers to your location now. Please tell me exactly where you are in the school. Mr. Dawson gave the details quickly and clearly, his eyes never leaving Emma. He could see the terror in her face as she clung to the crate, her fear palpable. She was trembling again, her hands clutching the edges of the box, but this time she wasn't alone. Mr. Dawson would make sure of that. "I'm here, Emma," he said softly, making sure she could hear the calmness in his voice. "Help is on the way. You're not alone. This man, whoever he is, will not hurt you. I promise." As he ended the call, he stood up, his heart still pounding. His eyes flicked toward the door, knowing that no matter what happened next, everything was about to change. They were going to find this man, and he wasn't going to get away. The school was in a state of controlled chaos. Within minutes of Mr. Dawson's phone call, the authorities had arrived. The sound of police sirens filled the air, growing louder with every passing second. Officers swarmed the school, their uniforms a sharp contrast to the usual flow of students and staff in the halls. The atmosphere had shifted from the normal hum of a busy school day to a tense, urgent calm. The threat was real, and everyone was on high alert. The principal quickly coordinated with the police, locking down the school to ensure no one could leave or enter the building. Teachers ushered their students into classrooms, locking the doors behind them and pulling the shades over the windows. The staff was well trained for situations like this, but the palpable fear in the air was new. No one had expected this. No one had ever thought a stranger would breach the walls of their school. Mr. Dawson remained in the janitor's storage room with Emma, his protective instincts never faltering. He had promised her she was safe, and he would make sure of it. Emma, still shaken, clung to him, her eyes wide with fear. But he could see the tiniest spark of hope in her now, knowing that the danger was being handled, that help was on the way. The police wasted no time in securing the school. As officers moved swiftly through the hallways, one of them entered the office and quickly began pulling security footage from the school's cameras. They scrolled through the footage from the previous hour, reviewing the footage from every corner of the building. And then there he was. The footage was grainy, but unmistakable. The man, the one who had been following Emma, was inside the school. He walked the hallways with an air of calmness, as if he belonged. His dark clothing and cap blended him into the shadows, but the security cameras had caught his every move. He lingered near the younger classrooms, his eyes scanning the hallways, his every step deliberate. As the camera zoomed in on the footage, the officers saw him hover near Emma's classroom, watching it from just outside the door. He was close, too close. Emma's words echoed in Mr. Dawson's mind. He's here. He's inside. The footage confirmed everything. The man was not a figment of Emma's imagination. He was real, and he was right there, inside the very walls of the school. The officers didn't waste a moment. The man was still somewhere in the building, and they had to act fast. They split up, methodically searching every hallway, every stairwell, until they finally found him. He was trying to leave through a side exit, attempting to blend in with the normal flow of students. He had no idea the officers were closing in on him. As the officers approached, the man noticed them too late. His hands shot up in a defensive gesture, his eyes widening as the officers took him into custody. His first words, as always, were defensive, an excuse, a lie. "I was just lost," he muttered, his voice shaky but laced with arrogance. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just looking for the exit." The officers didn't buy it. His story didn't match up with the evidence. They moved quickly, cuffing his wrists and patting him down. He was nervous, trying to keep his composure, but there was something in his eyes, something that betrayed his lie. He wasn't just lost. He had been following Emma. He had been inside the school with a purpose. As the officers searched his pockets, one of them found something chilling. A folded-up photograph, carefully tucked away. It was an old photo, yellowed at the edges, of none other than Emma. The photo was a close-up shot of her face, taken as she was smiling at the camera, probably a school picture. It wasn't a random photograph. It was a photo of Emma, and it had been carefully placed inside the man's pocket, hidden away. Mr. Dawson's blood ran cold when he heard the officer's voice break the silence. "We've got something here. A photo of the girl." The man's face paled as the officer held up the photograph, his entire demeanor shifting. No longer was he the calm, collected figure from moments before. Now he was cornered, and the reality of his actions was sinking in. The officers didn't need to ask more questions. The photo was enough evidence, proof that the man had been following Emma, that his presence inside the school was no accident. As the man was escorted out of the building, the weight of the situation still hung in the air. Officers quickly moved to secure the photo as evidence, and the school was finally safe. But for Emma, the damage had already been done. She had been living in fear, convinced she was being stalked, with no one believing her. But now, the truth was undeniable. The man who had been terrorizing her was in custody, and he would face the consequences of his actions. Mr. Dawson, though relieved that Emma was safe, couldn't shake the image of the man's face, his unease when the photograph was found. He had known something was off from the beginning, but now the truth had come out in full force. The fear Emma had been carrying for so long was finally validated, and that in itself was a victory. As the police continued to clear the school, and the last of the officers filed out, Mr. Dawson returned to the janitor's storage room where Emma had stayed. He found her sitting on the crate, her body still trembling, but there was something different in her eyes, a flicker of hope, a small sense of relief. She was safe now. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "Thank you for believing me." Mr. Dawson smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. "You're safe now, Emma. That's all that matters." And with that, the terror that had gripped her for so long began to loosen, piece by piece, leaving only the truth and the promise of a safer tomorrow. The sun had started to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow through the school windows. The hallway was quieter now, the rush of students a distant memory. The chaos of the afternoon had settled into a quiet peace, one that felt foreign after everything Emma had experienced. She stood at the end of the hallway, her small hand clutching her mother's, the weight of the day finally starting to lift off her shoulders. Emma's mother, her face streaked with tears, rushed into the school, her footsteps echoing against the walls. She had been frantic ever since Mr. Dawson called her, his voice calm but urgent. When she had arrived, her heart had nearly stopped when she saw her daughter, standing safe. The fear in her eyes finally replaced with a quiet relief. Her arms wrapped around Emma, pulling her close, tears of gratitude and guilt mixing together. "I should have listened to her," Emma's mother sobbed, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have believed her. She wasn't imagining it. I should have seen the signs." Emma, still in her blue dress, her hair now carefully braided, held on to her mother tightly. She hadn't said much since the police took the man away, but now, standing in her mother's arms, she finally felt safe. The world around her felt more solid, more certain. She was no longer just a scared child with an unfathomable terror lurking in the shadows. She was a little girl who had been heard, who had been believed. And it was all because of one man, a janitor in green overalls, whose name she would never forget. Mr. Dawson had remained in the background throughout most of the scene. He didn't want attention, didn't seek praise. As the officers escorted the man away, he stood at the doorway of his janitor's closet, arms crossed, silently watching over Emma and her mother. He wasn't the one making headlines, wasn't the one whose face would be splashed on the news. But that didn't matter to him. He had done what needed to be done. He had noticed the signs when no one else had, and he had acted. The officers were already beginning to leave, their work done for the day. The man who had been lurking in the shadows, watching and following Emma, was now in custody. He would face the consequences of his actions, and the truth had finally been exposed. Emma no longer had to live in fear, wondering if the nightmare would ever end. "Thank you," Emma's mother said to Mr. Dawson, her voice breaking as she stepped toward him. She reached out and gripped his hand, the gesture filled with gratitude. "I don't know what we would have done without you. You saved her." Mr. Dawson gave a small, humble smile. "I just did what anyone should do. I just listened." He didn't think of himself as a hero. In his mind, he was just a janitor doing his job, but today, his role had been so much more. He had been the one to notice when something wasn't right. He had been the one to listen when others hadn't. And that made all the difference in the world. It was a small act, stopping to listen to a frightened child, but it was one that changed everything. As Emma walked down the hallway again, this time with her mother by her side, her smile was brighter than it had been all day. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. Her mother held her close, and for the first time in weeks, Emma felt like she could breathe again. Mr. Dawson watched them walk, his eyes following their every step as they made their way down the hall. He stood silently in the doorway of the janitor's closet, his arms crossed, a protector in the background, ever watchful. And as he watched Emma smile, his heart lightened. He had done his job. No medals, no accolades, no attention. But that was enough. Sometimes the people who protect us aren't the ones in uniforms. Mr. Dawson thought quietly to himself. Sometimes they're the ones who simply decide to stop and listen. The hallway was quiet once again, and this time it was filled with a sense of calm that had been absent for far too long. Emma was safe. Her mother was safe. And for the first time, their world felt a little less terrifying. As Emma and her mother walked further down the hallway, Emma glanced up at her mom, her face still radiant. The horrors of the past few days would never fade, but the future looked brighter. As she walked with her mother by her side, she felt the weight of her fear lift. For the first time, she was truly free. "Look, Mama," she said softly, her voice still trembling but filled with hope. "We're okay. I'm okay." Emma's mother smiled down at her, a tear slipping from her eye as she nodded. "Yes, baby, you're okay." And as they walked, their footsteps echoing against the walls, a new chapter in their lives began. One where Emma would no longer have to face the world in fear, where the shadows that had once haunted her would never be able to reach her again.